Anish, who is Ted Lasso and why do you like him so much?
A great question. Ted Lasso, so he's a character on a show that's done on Apple TV, and it's really funny because the backstory was initially he was a character that NBC used for a commercial to market the EPL in America. And it was literally just like a 5-minute skit that they did online, and they got Jason Sudeikis to come in and be this like bumbling idiot American that tried to go over to the UK and, try to be funny and understand soccer, particularly from a football perspective. And they did it was so funny that they did it again, like in terms of they had a second year where they ran the same thing. And then eventually Apple TV picked it up for a show. And to me, it was one of those shows that like when you watch it, and I think it's 2 seasons through now, like you feel so good about yourself. Like after watching it, like it's one of that you feel happy, you're like super, grateful. There's a lot of like lessons that are like nice. It's just one of those, like for me, it was very refreshing because I remember watching it during COVID and, everything's sad outside and depressing and, then you're like, oh Jesus. And so you watch it and you're like, oh, this is like nice. This is like a nice guy who's like talking about really nice things. And, so yeah, that's kind of the reason why it kind of came out. But have you seen it? Have you seen the episodes or watched it before?
I haven't. I totally just creeped your website and then tried to find something to glom on for an intro. But welcome to How It's Meant, the podcast where we chat with people about Ted Lasso and also about people who are shaping the future of health tech and healthcare. Today, our guest is the one and only writer extraordinaire, amateur sports analyst, and investment analyst at Canadian VC firm Amplitude Ventures, Anish Kaushal. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you so much. Appreciate the intro. It's nice to hear. Yeah, doing good today.
Yeah, what's new with you? What's going on?
Not much, just, busy working. I mean, I was actually in Vancouver earlier this week for diligence on a company. Yeah, exactly. You know what? It was so quick though. Like I got there Tuesday night. I had meetings all day Wednesday and like flew out Thursday morning. So I wish I spent more time, but man, like Vancouver's so nice. Like when it's sunny and you drive around, you're like, holy crap, this is like incredible. Like mountains everywhere, the water, like anyway. So yeah. So anyway, I was busy doing that. And then, we have events and stuff coming up and like I was at one last night. It's being a VC, the fun life of being a VC for sure.
We'll talk about that later because it seems like it's a lot more involved than just reading reports and doing what the pretty dry title investment analyst implies.
Yeah.
But I guess, so for some context, listener, Anish and I chatted a little while back when he reached out after episode with Dr. Apuz. It's episode 15 of our Physician Founded series. And he seemed like a cool guy. And his story was super relevant or is super relevant to people who want to get into health tech from another field, for example, from medicine in Anish's case. So, I mean, that's kind of the overall overarching explanation. So Anish, you've got an MBBS, so that's the equivalent of an MD, and I'll edit in the record scratch later about, how did you get here? But you got the degree. So why aren't you working as a physician in Canada, despite the massive shortage of physicians that are facing?
Yeah, great question. So I think for me, it was figuring out, and I was fortunate enough when I was in school that I didn't absolutely love what I was doing. So, medicine was when I got in, it was a great job. I thought I was decent at it. I knew what I was doing. I thought it was okay, but I never woke up like really excited to go to work. Like I didn't enjoy hospital environments, even clinics that I worked in. I was like, okay, yeah, this is fine as a job. Like I know what I'm doing, but I wasn't like, oh, this is super exciting and interesting and different. And so for me, what happened, and a lot of it was, I mean, we can go into the story or if you want or not, but essentially a lot of the reason why I left was also a lot of circumstances and timing so because I went to school abroad, and I didn't end up getting a residency spot for a Canadian job, I also had basically like a year off to kind of figure out what I wanted to do. And from that year off, I was actually initially supposed to take a master's degree. Like it was a 1-year master's where you learned about drug discovery and the pharma industry. And so that was my initial plan. And that was what I thought I was going to do. And, maybe come back to medicine, not really sure, but see if I could get essentially more education. And during that time, I just literally started applying to jobs, started talking to people, having conversations. And then, somehow one opportunity came up that was really interesting and they liked me. And so I said, okay, like, why not try this thing? And it was crazy because I think so it was a VC firm that was based in the Netherlands. And I will never forget, like the first month I was in there, I woke up one morning and I was like so excited to go to work. Like I was actually, for the first time in my life, I was like, I cannot wait to get to work and like learn from these people. And I can guarantee you in medicine, in 6 years that I was doing it, I never once felt that. Like, I liked seeing friends and I liked partying and I liked doing all the other stuff. But in terms of getting up to go to a clinic or go to a hospital, I never felt that. And so for me, it was just, I think I got really fortunate. I found a really good opportunity. I really liked it and thought, okay, like, let me see where this takes me and see where it goes.
Yeah. So before we drop off into I guess, the beginning of your story, like what in particular excited you about your work with M Ventures?
Yeah, it was honestly just the fact that it was so different. Like it was so unique. All these people were really smart. I was like looking at stuff where like at that time we were doing a lot of oncology research. So I was like reading a lot of oncology papers, looking at companies that are like, how are they targeting like different ways to, target different types of cancers, whether it's like a cell therapy, gene therapy, small molecule, like antibody, like, and also just the idea of like learning something brand new where, you have to understand like mouse data and in vivo data and like, how to search on PubMed. And especially with topics that I like have no background with, right? Like, so I was never a scientist. Like, I didn't spend any time in the lab. Like I did some research when I was in university, but that was all like clinically based and a lot of like database research and stuff. So I knew how to like read papers and stuff, but that was about it. Like I'd never actually like pipetted and done all of that. And so to me, it was like the fact that I could learn something completely new that was really interesting. And also the people that I worked with were really cool and like really smart, really interesting, like vast experience across like the world, which was so awesome. And so you get to hear these people like talk about, the drugs of the future and how they're funding and also be able to, I think the experience of like being at a pharma company where like, we also interfaced with like their internal teams on the like oncology side. So they would tell us like, oh, this is interesting. This is not interesting. Like that kind of stuff was like very cool because it was so different. Like it's so different than medicine. There was no admin. There's no like writing notes. There's no, the classic stuff that you have to deal with. Like it was just like, oh, me reading and seeing all these really cool companies come pitch to us and thinking about like the future of oncology. And so that was part of the reason why I thought it was really, really cool.
So you didn't miss writing notes one bit. I'm personally
I,
offended by that.
I have to say I did not. I can guarantee you that. Yeah.
So I mean, so to go way, way, way back to the beginning,
Mhm.
did you grow up in a household where the a career in medicine was kind of like foisted on you, or was it something that you decided early on?
I would say kind of a mix of both. I would say it wasn't maybe necessarily like, this is what you're doing, you have to do this, but it was also like subconsciously like, oh yeah, like you should be a doctor because like, doctors are great and that's what you should do. And also like, when you're younger, like I was decent at science and math. And so the standard answer and standard thing to do is this is how you kind of, this is the path that you're going to take. But I mean, I would never say like my parents were like, oh, you absolutely have to do medicine. Like this is the only thing you can do. It was more like, we think that you'd be good at it. And like, at the same time, like a lot of my parents' friends, even though my parents aren't doctors, I had a lot, like their friends are doctors and my aunt is a doctor. And so like growing up and seeing those kinds of people, I think around, and like just understanding like, when you're a kid and in high school and you're good at science and math and then like observe or like you go to a clinic and you're like, okay, I guess this is the job. Like, I guess this is cool. And so like, you make that decision when you're so young, and, not realizing as you eventually, when you go through medicine, you're like, oh shit, this is very different than what I thought it was going to be. And I think the idea that, especially a lot of, I keep thinking about immigrant parents where it's like, people think of doctors mostly for like reputation. It's like, oh, you'll get a good job, like you'll do really well, like you'll make a lot of money, like it's great. And that's fine and it's true. And I'm not going to discount that. But at the same time, like it's a grind and it's tough and it's long hours and sometimes like very repetitive doing similar things. And to me, it was like, if you don't love it when you're doing it, then like, you're not really sure. And so going back to your original question, sorry, I'm like, what I was forced into it, not necessarily, but it was kind of always like, that was the path I was going to take.
Hmm. That's fair enough. And I mean, whether or not you were forced into it and whether or not it was of your own volition, you didn't end up going to Canadian medical school. I mean,
Hmm.
you'd mentioned before that you had applied, but you chose
Hmm.
to go out of the country. Like,
Hmm.
what was the thinking behind that? Because I know that quite a few of my colleagues here in Western have done that, but I'm
Yeah.
not sure what the thought process was.
Yeah. So for me, honestly, the reason why was because I had started doing some research when I was in like, I think it was like grade 10, grade 11, and you could get into medicine directly out of high school. And so that was a big game changer for me where, in the UK and in Ireland and like down south, like in the Caribbean stuff, like you could go right out of high school. And so that became interesting because it was like, then I could avoid the like doing the undergrad, taking the MCAT, and like maybe not doing well or like, not being able to interview properly. Cause like I remember seeing it with so many of my friends and, you all have stories. I'm sure you knew many people too, like where, they went into science and it's like, I'm going to be a doctor for sure. And then you don't do well on organic chemistry or chem or physics or whatever. And your MCAT score, like you're deficient in one section out of the whole thing. And it's like, this person would be a good doctor. They applied 3 years in a row. They write it, they study for an MCAT 3 months of the year, every single year. And then they don't get in. And then you're like kind of sitting there like, oh shit, like, I'm kind of stuck because I've always wanted to do this thing. And now what else am I going to do? And so I think for me, I was just fortunate because I think my parents or like, especially my dad had the foresight to be like, hey, like if you can go abroad and get in right out of high school and you can take that opportunity now, then you can deal with all this residency stuff and getting into a job afterwards. But at least at the end of it, you get a degree that's in medicine, like you get a medical degree, right? And so you don't have to take that risk. So a lot of it was for that reason, genuinely. And then also it was just the idea of like, if I could study abroad, how cool would that be? Like, being able to, I think like I was just very fortunate that I had the opportunity to do that because I know a lot of people don't. And, I'm super lucky and privileged that I did have that. But being able to study abroad, like in anything and in any opportunity, being able to leave your country and where you are to go to a brand new place and figure your life out, is super like, for me, it was super gratifying because like you learn a lot about yourself, you learn a lot about the world, you learn a lot about other people. And you meet, and like, you realize like, you can go to all these places and like, you're just as good as all of these other people. Cause I think that was the other thing I struggled with a lot at the beginning was this imposter syndrome that, we all have. And I don't think ever really goes away, but, coming from Canada, I was like, going to like, I went to the University of St. Andrews where like, the Royals went, like Prince William and Kate. And, you show up there and it's all these people from like the top schools in the UK that are coming, that are all top of their class. And like, you're sitting there and you're like, and at the time I was 17 because I ended up skipping a grade. So like, I was really young, right? So I was the youngest by years. Like I was sitting next to people who were like 21, 22. And I'm here's like the 17-year-old kid just like sitting there like, oh, okay, what am I going to do now? And so for me, like, and then when you get there, you're like, okay, I can kind of figure this out. Like, I'm not as dumb as I think I am. Like, okay, I kind of know some things. And so, yeah, so really like the reason why was mostly just because of the opportunity to leave right out of high school and to sort of get that degree and then to kind of deal with all the stuff down the road. But yeah, no regrets about it. Best decision I ever made for sure.
I mean, would you still say that it's the best decision ever made? Still, because I mean, just thinking about the next steps coming back to Canada, you had a bit of a struggle, didn't you?
Yeah.
Can you tell us
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So it still was, and I would do it again in a heartbeat, and I would always sign up for it. So in terms of, I guess, the struggles to get back to Canada. So basically at the time when I was applying back, you had to do 2 exams. So one of them was the key. It was like the MCC-EE or something. That was, you probably heard about it. Exactly. It gives me nightmare. Where you're like, learning about why avocado is like a great thing. Anyway, there's all these stupid questions that are not even relevant. And so anyway, so at the time when I was applying back, we had to do the McKee and the NACOSCI. So it was like the clinical exam that you kind of had to do. And so what happened was initially when I joined the program that I joined, it was a very new program. So the program was called like the sort of Edinburgh St. Andrews Canadian medical program, basically where they take like 10 to 15 kids out of high schools in Canada. So like a lot of my classmates were all Canadian. So like from Vancouver, from like Toronto, from elsewhere. And they take them and you train in the UK. So you do 6 years there. You also do like a sort of summer of elective. And like, we were at the U of A in Alberta. So I spent the summer in Edmonton. And during that time, they like help you get back to Canada. Okay. So that was the initially like when it was conceived, but we were the second year that it had started. So it was brand new. Like there was no training. There was no, like, they literally just started this and we were like the guinea pigs almost, basically. Yeah.
I'm sure.
It ended up being a very big gong show. Because so essentially they like told us, so like, oh, we're going to help you. Like, oh, we'll do our best to make sure like, you guys are well positioned to get back to Canada. And I remember having a conversation in my 4th year. So this is when I was going to my clinical rotations, like at the University of Edinburgh. And I sat down with like the preceptor, essentially our supervisor for like the program. And he was actually a doc that's in the U of A. And I was like, oh, what is your definition of success? Like how many people, like it was, I think 10 of us applying. He's like, how many people do you think are going to get in like to a residency spot? He's like, the first time, I think it's going to be about 80%, like 8 to 10 of you will get a job. I was like, that's okay. That's pretty good odds. Like, the other 2 people, like, you spend a year, you do something else and you come back, no problem, all good. And then what you realize as you go through it is they had no idea about the exam, about preparation, about tutoring, about like how to do well, how not to do well. They also gave us wrong information. So he told me at the time, he was like, all you have to do for the McKee is pass, and you pass in NACOSCI. And if you do all the research and, observerships and reports and writing and all that, you'll be fine and you can get an interview. And after that, like it's out of our hands. And I'm like, okay, that's great. Like, so, every summer I was home, I did the research, I got the papers, I had first author publications, I did the observerships, I did all the electives, I did all of that. Turns out after I finished the McKee, that it's not, you need to get a good mark. And so what happened for me was I ended up getting, so there was a threshold for cutoffs for most of the programs that you need to get. I think it was about 325 and the pass mark was 275 or 250, I think it was. I got right in the middle. And so for me, the problem with that was you can't retake the exam. And I had nothing, I was stuck, right? So at the time, I couldn't do anything. I was basically like, and the thing was, is I didn't know that until I went through the process. And then when I went through the process, I was like, oh shit, like there's literally nothing for me to do. And so that's why, like, this idea, like exactly your point of the difficulty of getting back to Canada, I just, I was stuck. Like I was like, I can't, get in. And, thankfully I've had friends who have gone, kind of similar situations to me. They got rid of the McKee. They added another exam that you could do that you could take again if you didn't get a good score. So like things have changed. And so like people got back together, but I'm not saying, but for me at the time when I was applying back, it was a shit show basically. And so because of that, I didn't get a job. I didn't get any interviews. So I didn't have a job in Canada that year. And then also this program, which is kind of a side story. I don't want to go too much into it, but basically even though we trained in the UK, they didn't allow us that year to get a UK residency job, which is so stupid because they also have a shortage of doctors in the UK as well. And here's all these people from Canada that they trained that they didn't give a job to, which ended up being a bunch of bullshit. Because like they blamed the government, they blamed the school, they blamed other people. And we actually have to fight for it. So like our year, like me, like we contacted lawyers, we like thought about talking to the media. We went to the Dean of Medicine, we went to like the Dean of Edinburgh University. And eventually, thankfully, things got changed. But because of that, I had the year off. And so that year off was when, I kind of mentioned before, I sort of went through the thing. I was going to do something different. And so it's interesting now because now looking back, I am so thankful that I fucked up or failed. Like I'm so thankful that like I didn't do well at that exam. No, like seriously, because I know if I did and I got a job, I would be doing medicine. Like it wasn't like I didn't have the foresight to say like, oh, like I want to be doing something else, like for sure right after medical school. It was, again, luck and timing and circumstances worked out really well. I was super grateful for it. And I just saw this other opportunity. I was like, okay, I'm just going to push and see where this goes. And so, yeah, talking about like, getting back to Canada, it's hard, man. Like, especially for internationals, even if you're Canadian, like there's no benefit. And the thing that you realize is like I had friends who they didn't do nearly as much research. They didn't do nearly as much electives, they didn't do nearly the thing, but they got good grades on those tests and they got interviews and they got jobs. And so like, that's the thing that I realized for me that again, I just didn't have the information at the time. Would it have changed how I studied? I'm not really sure. You never know. But yeah, like it was more marks dependent than I thought. And so, yeah, it was essentially that was kind of the story of my difficulty getting back.
That must have been like absolutely heartbreaking at that time to like finish that exam and to realize like there's kind of no way out because you can't practice in the NHS and you can't practice in Canada. So like, why did you think to go the route of that master's for drug discovery? Was that like a reflexive path, or was that something that you and your family had thought of during that time?
So I would say more reactionary-ish in terms of like, well, I wanted to, so essentially like so when I was studying for finals was around February of my final year, and we found out like March basically, right? But I knew I didn't get any interviews from like December or whatever. So I was like, okay, I'm not going back to Canada this year. That's fine. And I still wasn't sure. But by the time I was studying for finals, I was like, okay, I'm kind of out of this. Like, I really don't, like, I don't know if I love this. I want to see if I can take a year to do something different. And so at the time, I actually started talking to like bankers and consultants. So I interviewed for consulting for actually in April of that year. In London, didn't end up getting it, and then interviewed for a bank a couple of weeks later and didn't end up getting that either. But so I was already having ideas of like, okay, I want to do something different. And so the backup for that year was this sort of drug discovery pharmacology degree. And the reason I picked that one was because I had a friend from undergrad who went to that program. She did it. She got a job out of it. And she was like, listen, like you with an MD background, you come into here, you can get any job you want in the pharma industry, no problem, because you're an MD. Like you have this, and like I think their placement rate was like 80 to 90% in terms of getting a job. I was like, okay, that's great. And so I had a conversation with my parents. I was like, listen, like, I already know that I kind of don't want to do this. I want to see if I can do something different. Like this year feels like a good thing where I'm still getting an education. I'm still busy. I'm still doing something, and I can get a job out of it. And so I also like, I went down to London. I talked to the program director. I met like people on staff, and like, I looked through the syllabus and everything. I was like, oh, this is great. Like it's a year. I get to learn all this stuff. It's really cool. Like from an industry perspective. And so that was kind of the reason to sort of go down that path.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, did you get to be part of that like 89% placement rate in terms of getting a job out of the drug discovery route?
I didn't end up, so this is the thing. I didn't actually end up doing that degree. So I didn't do this master's degree. So initially what happened was the plan was I was going to do it. So basically I graduated July, end of June, 2018. The master's degree started end of September. Okay. So the entire summer I was applying to jobs, got rejected from all of them. Then August comes around. My dad says, hey, like, have you heard of this thing called venture capital? I'm like, not really, but okay. I thought it was literally, the show Silicon Valley, and they talk about like tech and all of that stuff. I literally thought it was that. So I didn't know it was, I genuinely didn't know that healthcare VC existed. Like I literally had no idea. And he's like, oh, have you heard of it? And so literally what I did was I just cold emailed like 75 VC firms around the world. I said, hey, like I just graduated medical school. I would love to talk to you if you had any advice for me on my career and what I'm doing. And as you can imagine, most people don't respond. A couple of people did, which was really nice. Some people got on the phone. And then this one group, M Ventures, got back to me and said, hey, we have an internship program. It's 6 months. Are you interested? And what's crazy is when I sent the email, that program wasn't advertised. So I didn't even know it existed, right? So it was literally like a shot in the dark. I have no idea. And again, you have to remember up till this point, I'd applied to all these jobs. I got rejected. I was like, okay, yeah, of course I'm interested, but I'm not going to get this job. No way they're going to take a chance on me. And so that was why this master's program was always in the background. So that was like my essentially like backup plan almost. Because I knew like I was going to London to do this master's degree if I didn't get this job. Like that was the plan. And so, yeah, basically went through like 3 rounds of interviews and they're like, yeah, we really like you. We'll see you in Amsterdam. And so that's like literally like, it was 3 days before I was about to move to London. I had to completely change my life around. I had to like, figure out how to get to Amsterdam, figure out all of the stuff, how to live and all of that. So yeah, so I didn't actually end up doing the degree, but still I think would have been really interesting because their placement rate was so good.
So why aren't you still with M Ventures?
It was an internship. So it was an internship for 6 months. And basically halfway through, they said like, oh, we don't have a job for you basically after. So like, we can help you try and get a job after, but like you can't really stay. And I was like, okay, no problem. And so did essentially the same kind of recruiting, research, reaching out to people, cold calls, emails, like talks, conversations, everything I could. And yeah, eventually was fortunate. I got three final round interviews with 3 firms. One was in Germany, one was in San Fran, and one was in Canada with Amplitude. I thought, you know what? At that point, I'd been gone from Canada for 7 years. I was like, damn, if I can come home and build something here in Canada, like, sure, I'll do it. And so that's kind of how I ended up joining back in 2019.
And like in the past 2 minutes, you've alluded multiple times to recruiting, content, et cetera. And you've actually got like a process down. So you have a post on Medium called So You Want to Be a VC. And namely, you highlight like prioritize, contact, and recruit. One of the questions that I always ask guests when they come on is how they would explain a concept that's important to them to a 5-year-old with only monosyllabic and bisyllabic words. So I don't know what kind of 5-year-old you talk to. And Emma was the most popular girl name in 2022. So for example, can you explain to little Emma how she could become or how she could join the VC world?
Okay. So Emma, I would say, firstly, Emma, you have to figure out what you like to do. So I think that's really important. It's like, do you like numbers? Do you like science? Do you like clinical stuff? Do you like research? Like what kind of role do you like? I think that's the first thing. Also thinking about where do you want to live? So for me, that was a big question. Like, do you want to live in Europe? Do you want to live in Canada? Do you want to live in the US? Do you want to live elsewhere? Because that also limits kind of how you're doing. And then in terms of reaching out to people, it's really just, okay, so once you know what you kind of like to do, you make a list of like the things you like to do, basically like the jobs or ideas. Then you basically go online, you just type in Google, firms that do this kind of thing. So, let's say venture capital, you type in healthcare venture capital on Google and say, who are the healthcare venture capital firms in the world? You make a list of all of them. You look at their website, you see what they do, you see where they're located, you see who the contact person is. And then essentially you start to reach out to them. And so when you reach out to them, you just send a short email, very quick note, and you say, hey, this is my name. This is who I am. Looks super interesting. Here's my background. I would love to have a conversation with you if you're open to it. If not a problem. And that's it. And then but you also have to make sure you send it to enough people. So Emma, you can't do it to one person. You can't do it to 5 people. You have to send it to 50 people or 100 people. Literally as many as you can, because the point is what you end up learning, or what I learned, is that all it takes is one person to say yes. But if you limit yourself by only applying to a small amount of opportunities, then you haven't done the work. Basically, it's much harder to be successful versus if you send it to as many people as possible. Because the most important thing to me at the beginning is the first job, like getting in. Getting in is the hardest part, because once you're in, then you can make your career and then you can do everything else. And it's much easier kind of after that. And so Emma, once you've sent the emails, maybe you've got some responses, people come back to you, then you have to learn how to have a conversation. You have to learn how to talk to people. You have to learn what should you ask them about. You have to learn, how do you speak about what they're doing and their interests? Because the thing as well I've learned is whenever you're talking to people, particularly with recruiting, always make it about them. And this is the thing that I think people do very poorly, mostly in networking, is they talk about themselves so much and they don't show interest in the other person. I actually think it's backwards, where most of your conversation should be about the other person and other individual, because everybody likes to talk about themselves, Emma, we all do. And then once they talk about themselves for 25 minutes, if you, let's say a half-hour conversation, then they talk about themselves for 25 minutes. They feel really good about themselves because they get to tell you about their story and what they're doing. And then at the end, you say, hey, by the way, I'm looking for things, or, if you have advice or resources on people I should reach out to, please let me know. And then you literally do that again and again and again and again and again. And I think, when I was recruiting and when I did this, I think I had maybe over 50 conversations the second time, if not more. And so you're talking to everybody that will talk to you, right? So you eventually just get in the habit and you have to go and go and go. And again, it's also, it can of course be demoralizing. And that's the other thing I would say to Emma is like, don't get frustrated. Like, it's okay. It will take time. Like, things may happen. They may not. It's all good. Just stick to it. Like, stick to the plan, keep it consistent, be disciplined about it. And don't take things personally. If somebody says no to you, not a problem. Like, you can move on. It's okay. It's not personal. It's all good. And so, yeah, I hope that kind of covers most of the things, and that was simple enough, but that's the way I would kind of think about it. First, you have to figure out what you like to do. You reach out to the people that do that thing. You have conversations with them, and essentially you talk about them and then see where it goes from there.
I mean, it seems like you've got like the process pretty down pat, but I mean, it's you've been in VC for how many years now? So
4 years.
4 years. Okay.
Yeah.
And you said that you flew to Vancouver recently for a meeting, and then you came back and you had more events. So again, as I said in the beginning, the life of an investment analyst seems to be more than just, as you alluded to before, reading papers and summarizing data, etc. What is the life of an investment analyst?
Yeah, so it's a good question. And I would say you would get a different answer depending on who you speak to. And so it depends. Like, I hate this because it's also the truth, but the favorite answer of every VC is always, it depends, because there's like so many circumstances where, I could say this and this and that. And so I'll give you an example. So I can tell you about my role at Amplitude versus my role at M Ventures, because it was essentially the same like title, but like, very different. So when I went to M Ventures, when I first started, it was a bigger organization. There was many more people, processes were there. It had existed for 10 years. And so you go in and it's very defined. So it's like, we need you to analyze oncology companies. That's your job. And so you come in, there's 10 pitch decks that get sent to me. I take a look at them. I come up with a thesis and like why it's interesting or not. I present it to my supervisors. They say yes or no. We get on a call. I take notes, continue to work on it, see if it goes anywhere or not. So that was like very structured, very defined. When I came to Canada and Amplitude, it was very different because we were starting the firm. And so I actually got to build a lot of the processes and operations. So like our deal flow system, I'm responsible for. Like all of our social media for a long time, I was responsible for. Our marketing, I do a lot of. I would write a blog that we do with Amplitude. I also do a lot at the beginning. I helped a lot with reporting and operations on the back end. So like, if we needed presentations done, or, if our CFO, like every quarter we have to send updates to our investors. So like the updates get sent to me to like update every company. So like I have to be in tune with everything that's going on essentially across our portfolio. And so, going to your point about, looking at papers and doing review, I still do that too, right? So if a company comes in, I still put on a deal or looking at a company, I still have to go and analyze and do competition and market and assessment and question lists and, data rooms and all of that. And then also do a bit more on the fundraising side. So like preparing data rooms, preparing presentations, talking to investors, talking to fellow co-investors. And so to your point that, the question about being at these events, what's great now about post-COVID is now events are starting to happen in person. So like getting back out there, like for example, a VC group here in Toronto had their annual annual day, annual event last night. And so you show up, you're meeting all these other investors, you're talking to people. And so yeah, it's kind of all encompassing. And that's also why I love what I do, is because every day is very different. And what also is great is like I get to set my own schedule. So, VC is a very independent job. So there's nobody on top of you every day that's telling you this is what you need to do this, like this and this. Obviously those happen. You'll get assignments, you'll do them and whatnot, but essentially most of your days are yours. And so you get to decide like, okay, where do you want to spend your time? How do you want, and what's nice is for me is, there are days where, an hour for lunch, I'll spend it reading about the stock market or investing or, watch an interview with like a really interesting person. And because like, I'm very fortunate because I have the time to do that, right? So like, I'm not in a clinic. I don't have notes to do. I don't have somebody like saying, you got to do X, Y, and Z. And so that's what's really nice about, I think, my role is that I like is it is very different. It is varied across the spectrum. You also have to be very multifaceted. Like, I have to be able to have conversations. I have to be able to write reports. I have to be able to, talk to people. Like I have to be able to do all of that. And that's what also I really enjoy, because you're kind of, and also you touch a lot of different areas, right? So like you have to VC, one of the things that everybody talks about too, is like, you're not a specialist in one specific area, but you have to learn how to learn quickly. And that was actually one of the best advice I got from my first boss when I first joined. And he said, like, we don't have to know everything as a VC at all, but you have to know how to learn very quickly. And so that I think is what I've been trying to refine over the last few years. But yeah, again, like you said, invest as an investment analyst, it's kind of all over the board.
Mhm. How do you learn to learn quickly? I think that's something that's actually pretty relevant skill, regardless of whether or not you're in medicine or whether or not
Mhm.
you're in VC.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one, you have to have a curiosity. I think like that's the other thing. And you have to always be like thinking that, there's more to learn and there's more to know. And even if I know a little bit about a thing, like I can still learn something. Because I think if you come in or if you go into an area and like, oh, I already know this, or I've heard about this before, I've done that, like it's not going to work because like you're just going to limit yourself. You're not going to be interested. I think also like the ability to read, like, you have to be able to want to read like very interesting things and also across subject areas, which is just, again, going back to this curiosity point. And then generally, like Google is your best friend. Like it's funny because sometimes people will ask you questions. Like I'll get on conversations with people and be like, hey, what about this? Or I have this question. And in my head, I'm like, literally, you could Google this in 2 seconds. You'd get an answer very quickly. Then you could go in, you could like learn from different people and like, you could come back with a much more refined thing. So I think a lot of it is just like, also to your point of like where to find the information, right? So like for me, if I get a specific ask, it's like, okay, how do I like based on the information I have, how do I know where to go? And like, where's the best answer? Like, where can I get the best thing? So I think a lot of it's just like, yeah, knowing the resources you have access to and the people you have access to, and then also just being interested, like genuinely interested in like a lot of things. And that's the thing for me is like, I literally am happy to learn about everything and anything. And that's what makes it fun. Cause like, I have no problem like being a beginner in like a new subject area.
Mhm. I mean, the characteristics that you talked about there, knowing your resources, knowing your limitations,
Mhm.
being willing to go find information, asking questions, or being willing to dig for information where others haven't necessarily been willing to dig for.
Mhm.
A lot of that sounds like there's a big crossover between venture capital, or how that skill set is applied in venture capital to how that skill set is applied in medicine.
Mhm.
But I mean, like, what are the main takeaways that you have or that you've had or noticed when it comes to overlapping skill sets otherwise between what you've learned at St. Andrews versus
Yeah.
what you've learned or what you've applied in your job now?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for me, the one that I didn't realize the value of at the time, but is actually so vital was the ability to do research. So exactly like you said, where, like when you're in medicine and you want to do research, I remember I like did not like it. I hated it. I was like, oh, this is like boring. Like, oh my God, like I got to write this paper and I got to, go on PubMed to find these 100 articles. And oh, are you kidding me? And like genuinely, like that is what I do now. And that is like such a valuable skill set. Like being able to critically assess papers, being able to read, be able to like find the information you want to, how do you look at bibliography to get notes from certain things? Like those like that skill in particular to me is like, was the transferable one that like genuinely set me up. Like if I didn't do research and if I didn't actually put in the time, I know one, I wouldn't have gotten this job likely, but two, I wouldn't have been able to continue now as is because like that skill, being able to learn, being able to exactly like you said, find the information, knowing where to go, knowing how to do that. Like it's a skill set that you like, for me, like I didn't want to do, like I didn't like it in medicine. You know what I mean? I was like, this is not great. I don't enjoy this, but now for my job, like it is why I got what I got and why I'm kind of here today. So I think that to me is like the biggest one. I think also like, I mean, what's nice about St. Andrews that we got lucky for, and a lot of medical schools, I don't think do a very good job of this, is communication skills. So, you don't get taught a class in med school, like how to talk to people. But we fortunately in St. Andrews, we literally had lectures and seminars on communication. Like how do you effectively communicate? How are you interested? Which again is very counterintuitive, you would think, because you're like, oh, talking to people is talking to people. It's easy. But you and I both know enough doctors that, their communication skills aren't the best. And social skills sometimes lack. So like that kind of stuff, is actually really important. It's like I know I can talk to anybody in the world about any kind of conversation and I'll be okay with that. And like be able to kind of develop that, like those kinds of things, like almost like the soft skills that everybody kind of talks about. Those are like so important to kind of what I do today.
That makes sense. So, I mean, talking about the cross applicability, or I guess the interaction between your MD world, as well as the world that you're in now. I guess the framing this question, there's been a long-standing association or negative, I guess, association between the words like, finance industry or
Mhm.
insurance, in healthcare. Given that, do you believe it's like inherently a contradiction to go to school to become an MD, then take the Hippocratic oath to do no harm to patients, to only do good, and then to
Mhm.
go to the finance industry for a job? Like, is that a contradiction, or is there some way that you think of it that I guess, makes you believe that what you're doing makes a greater impact on patients now than you would otherwise?
Yes. So I can argue both sides, and I've thought about this a lot, and I think that's important. So I would say, yes, it is a contradiction because exactly like you said, like sometimes I feel like I'm in an industry where, you're participating in the profit of like particularly, pharma drug pricing, like price gouging, like I am a part of that industry, whether that's good or bad, I am a part of it. And I know like, even if I'm not like at the actual company and actually developing the drug, I know our industry is part of that, and like we have to deal with that. So I'm not going to say like that's like I can't do that. At the same time, I know that one, me personally, I know my skill set. As a doctor, I'm just like anybody else, and I think the individual, like you can get one-on-one sort of gratification because you can solve a person's issue in front of you. You do really well by them. That's really nice to see, and why everybody kind of gets in at the beginning. Oh, I want to help people. Of course you do. And so for me, like what I think I realize now is like, there are people that are doing this anyway, this job in terms of like finance, in terms of like financing all these healthcare things. And a lot of them don't have clinical backgrounds. Like honestly, most of them are not doctors, right? Like they're engineers or they're scientists or but they haven't been in a hospital. They haven't been in a clinic. They haven't treated patients before. And so to me, when I left, I was like, okay, well, I think having that knowledge of like actually being like having a clinical background is useful when you're assessing and financing opportunities, because like, I actually know, is this going to be useful or not? Right. Like, and like, for example, like, we talk about health tech. Health tech is a great example. You have a lot of technology people, that are software guys or engineers or whatever. And they come in, they're like, oh, healthcare, easy. We can do that. Here's an app that like, does 5 things. And oh, you can plug it in and it's so easy to use. And oh, like it's no problem. And I always look at it, knowing doctors and also like being in clinics, doctors don't like new technology. And they don't like new things, or maybe some do, most don't. And also processes and the way they operate and the way they do their work, like their workflow, they do it their entire career. So if they learned a certain way to do certain things, trying to switch them is very difficult. And so for me, that's why like, this concept of when I left was I could apply my knowledge to actually help these companies and figure out what are good investments, what are things that I think could be useful. But then also too, to your point, it is the broader impact question, right? Where like, if I am sitting in a community and I'm a family doctor and I have my 1,000 patients on my roster and I benefit them, that's great. And I think that's important. And I love that. But if I can finance 5 companies that develop 5 different drugs that target 1 million patients, or develop or finance a company that's doing like a medical device that is touching people that are having strokes, that is way bigger. Because then you're actually like a part of something that like touches many more people's lives. And so to me, that's also a big part of like why I love what I do, is because like, down the road, touch wood, eventually the goal is to finance the companies that are the future and next wave. Obviously we don't know, things can happen, things can change. And that's why we get into VC. And that's why I do what to do at the early stages, because we're in a risk business. So I totally get it. But to me, like that makes it really interesting, and important. And so that's why like, I think like I'm very grateful for having that. Just kind of being part of this, be able to use my clinical knowledge to do this.
Mm-hmm. There's that applicability of clinical knowledge, but another, I guess, contradiction between medicine and venture capital is the risk tolerance, as you alluded to. There's the risk tolerance in medicine specifically that is pretty low in terms of being, I guess, wanting to avoid risk to patients as much as possible. Whereas in venture capital, you're kind of shooting for the stars. You're assessing risks as much as you can, but you're still shooting for the stars in trying to, finance a company which has a fairly high chance of failing in competition with all the other products out there, or that might fail in clinical trial number 3.
Well, yeah. So in terms of your question, I guess, is it more just like, how do you think about risk? Like in terms of the physician?
Yeah. How is your risk tolerance changed? Or how do you toggle between like thinking like a physician versus thinking like someone in VC, or have you just adapted more to a VC, like, thinking style?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say both, in the sense that I think when I initially came, obviously you have the conservatism in you. And I think even today, there's still like the way I assess companies is still with a clinical lens. So I'm always thinking like, is this useful in a clinic? Is somebody going to use this? Is this useful to like, what are the side effects? What's the tolerability? What's the dosing? Like stuff that a scientist or an engineer is not really going to think about it. It's like, oh, we have a trial, like, oh, it's fine. It's like, no, there's like many layers to like, how do you design it? What are you looking for? What are the endpoints? How does it actually affect the patient? Like, what is the difference in regulatory, like the regulatory endpoint versus the clinical endpoint that's actually meaningful? So all these things are still important. But at the same time, I'm also in the risk business. Like VC, exactly like you said, right? We have to take bets on the future, knowing that a lot of what we do will fail. Like we know that's why you do what we do. But at the same time, if you get the success, the upside is so great that it's worth it because you get to see it actually prove out to be true. And like the best example is not one I've been a part of, like in sort of my career, because it sort of predates me, but our firm financed this company called Clementia Pharmaceuticals, where this incredible woman came to one of our partners and said, hey, like I saw this research paper about this asset that exists at a pharma company, but I think it can be applied to a rare disease. Like, can we finance a company and like see if we can raise some money and go thing? So he was the first check in. I think it was like whatever, 500 grand to $1 million. I put the money in, eventually built the company, went through clinical trials, got to phase 3. Now that drug is approved in Canada for FOP. And this female raised a team, raised a company thing. She got a $1.3 billion exit, right? For what she did. And so, yeah, of course, as you mentioned, it could fail at many moments. And of course, there's lots of times where, things didn't look great. But when you have the success and when you have the outcome, one, you actually have a drug that's in patients' lives today, like people in Canada that have this bone disease, it's called FOP, have access to this drug that they never had before, which is incredible from a patient perspective. And then from an investor perspective, that return is unbelievable, right? So even if you had all these failures that you invested in, if you get a couple of those, it's still worth it. And so that's kind of how I think about it from the risk lens, right? Which is like, we're in the risk business. You have to take this. I also think personally, like I'm very fortunate because like I also like my career is a risk career. Like I took risks when people thought I was kind of nuts. Like everybody, like when I moved to Scotland at 17, people were like, that seems kind of crazy. It's like, yeah, it is. And then when I left medicine, people were like, seems kind of crazy. I'm like, yeah, it is too. And then it's go to Amsterdam and it's come to it like, so I think my life has been a bit like I've taken calculated risks at many times and I've been very fortunate, touch wood so far. Right. And so my thing is like, if I can keep taking asymmetric risk and calculated risks again and again, then it increases your chance of success. Because if you increase your chance of failure, then your chance of success goes up as well.
Yeah. So, I mean, just as a spin-off of that question, you've done like med school and you've done research, you've done plenty of clinical and research related experience in medicine, but what you haven't done is residency and like the decades long immersion that a lot of attendings have.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not sure how many attending physicians have gone on to go into VC roles themselves. But one of the criticisms that someone might have of your stance in terms of medicine or an MD in VC is that you don't have like that long-standing clinical experience.
Yes,
would you ever go back? Would you ever go back to medicine to, refine your experience and see how things have changed? Or are you happy where you are now? Or how would you address that criticism itself?
Yeah. So I think it's totally fair. I think it's accurate. I think it's true. But I also think for me, I don't think that I necessarily need that 10-year decade of experience because I think I can speak the same language and because I think I can get the same information and I can talk to the same people that actually have the knowledge and experience. That's more important. And it goes back to the thing before about like learning how to learn, right? Like I know now, like how to find the answers that is much more important versus let's say you took a resident or a person that's an attending has 10 years of clinical experience in one thing and you bring them into VC, they are a fish out of water. They have no idea what to look for. They have no idea what to do. They're not really sure how to ask questions. Yeah, they're very good at their job and they're very good at what they've done, but they don't understand the lingo and how to ask certain questions and where to get the information. And so to me, like that's one, I would say. To your second question about like, would I ever go back? Like it's never been on the cards and I wouldn't. I'm too far removed from that. I think I would always think about like, like how do I keep updated with like clinical like trial stuff and, if I get like courses in terms of like understanding, like, are there courses to keep up to date with like what sort of like what's the latest that's kind of happening? But also at the same time, I feel very fortunate because all of my friends are doctors and like I have doctors in my family and I have like physicians that I can contact. So like if I need a question or if I need to know something quickly, I literally can call up a friend and be like, hey, like, what do you think? Or what's the answer to this? And like, so to me, like, again, learning how to learn and learning, this idea of where to get the answers. I have so many resources that for me, I can get the answers to these questions pretty easily. So yeah, no, I think it's a valid question. And I think you're right. Like, I'm not hiding anything. Like I didn't do residency. So I'm not as qualified as, somebody who's an oncologist and been in a hospital for a decade. I absolutely know that. But I also know like I have 4 years of venture experience and I'm still really young. And I think that, has to count for something. So, yeah.
That's fair enough. And thank you for answering that question really candidly. I know that like it can be really easy to, take offense to that. So
Oh no, I don't
again,
take offense at all.
no,
It's the
no, no.
truth.
Thanks for answering that.
Yeah.
I guess just to start wrapping up this conversation, which health tech trends have you seen that you're paying the most attention to now and why?
Yeah. So health tech. So I guess let me keep that on the sort of device and the on digital health side. Well, more on that side than the biotech side, because biotech side like it's very vast and massive, and there's many. So on the method and device and things side, I think like a couple that like so liquid biopsies coming up a lot that I think is pretty interesting. I think I'm still skeptical as to the real use cases, just because some of the sensitivity and specificity of some of these tests is not that great. And so like, for example, like, there's a company called Grail that's in the US where, you get your blood test and like, oh, you have cancer because of X, Y, and Z. And right now, because the sensitivity and specificity aren't great, like imagine like I tell you, oh, the test says you have cancer, and then you have to do biopsies, you have to do imaging, you have to do all these things. And then it turns out you don't, right? And you spent all this
that's harm
Exactly.
done.
Exactly. And so like that is stuff where I think it's getting better and I think it's interesting. The reimbursement challenges on that are a little difficult. So like, it's still kind of early, I would say. On the device side, like non-invasive monitoring, I think right now is a really big thing that's happening, right? Like, the patches that people are doing, like, having an Apple Watch where you can do an EKG, like on your thing, like be able to assess, like, a lot of devices that be able to essentially give you insight that you never had before. Like, for example, I was talking to a digital health DC yesterday. He was telling me about, a non-invasive way to measure potassium. So like for dialysis patients, like they essentially have like this patch that can measure potassium pretty well. I'm like, oh, that's actually really interesting, right? Like there are clearly use cases for that where, I don't have to get the same kind of information that I had to sort of before. So those are stuff that I think is really cool. On the device, on the digital side, I think like digital therapeutics is one that I'm always paying attention to. I think is really interesting. Like, there's a company called Achille Bio that actually M Ventures was a funder of many years ago when I was there. And now I think went public recently actually by a SPAC where their treatment is a video game. Like the treatment for ADHD is a video game. Like that, and it's FDA approved. It went through clinical trials. It went through randomized control testing. And like, think about that concept. Just like imagine like, instead of giving a kid like, like Ritalin or like, essentially what's called an amphetamine.
A stimulant.
Like,
yeah.
Exactly. Stimulant. Like you have them play a video game and like the results are pretty good. Like that's pretty cool. Right. And so like you're having these sort of a lot of companies like in the digital therapeutic space, particularly I think also on the chronic disease side, like the diabetes, the heart disease, the chronic congestive heart failure, hypertension, where like if you can intervene where it's like non-invasive, you can do it on an app or phone or digitally. And also like the doctor and patient both has access to good information. That becomes really cool because then you can actually see like, the minor lifestyle changes where you get updates or reminders, or you have an app that's actually like FDA tested, approved, been through trials, can see like, how does it compare to like what currently existing? Like that stuff to me is really interesting. So I think like, and also the reason for that as well is like, it's not drugs. There's no side effects. There's no, you're not putting toxicity in your body. You don't have to worry about overdosing. And like, how does it interact with all these other things? It's like, if I can have an app that can treat my thing just as much, that becomes really interesting too. And I think also, especially on like the mental health side, like I think there's a lot of interesting use cases around like addiction, depression, anxiety. I'm still hesitant because you still have a lot of the like wellness apps. You have the Calms of the world, you have the Headspace of the world. And like, the data's pretty, we just don't know, in terms of like, they haven't been through trials to see like, is this actually improving or not? And so I'm always skeptical because anytime somebody tells you like, oh yeah, this is like doctor recommended and like, this is a good thing. It's like, well, it hasn't been to a trial and it's not FDA approved. So like, I'm not really sure. I think it's great. I would recommend it for everybody and I use it too. But to say that it's like an actual intervention is a little different. So the digital therapeutic side where there's actual interventions that have gone through trials that are FDA approved, those are really, really interesting because they're essentially new medicines that are completely digital, which is really cool. So yeah, I would say those are a couple of the ones that like thinking about paying attention to that like kind of interested in.
That's super awesome. I guess just to wrap up, I always ask our guests whether or not they have any pluggables to plug. I know you've got your website in terms of the main things that you write. Anything else that you like, that you're doing that you like to share?
Yeah, I mean, so the website, like if you want to find more about what we do, like from a firm perspective, the website's amplitudevc.com. You can take a look at what we do, mostly biotech stuff. So if you want to take a look at what's going on personally, like, yeah, exactly. Like you said, Jeff. So like the website is essentially like, is essentially a mini project that I started a couple of years ago. So like when I left medicine, I realized I had all this time on my hands because I wasn't doing research. I wasn't hanging out with friends. I wasn't like, worried about and stressed out about all this other stuff that every doctor has to do.
Writing notes.
Exactly. Just writing notes. And so essentially what it's funny you did that because I was essentially what I decided to do is instead was I just started reading and writing. So started like reading nonfiction books and writing in the journal. And that turned into much larger than I thought. So in the last like 4 years, I think I've read like 225 nonfiction books and taken notes on almost all of them. And then also written like maybe hundreds of blog posts on top of that as well, just about my life, what's going on, what I see in the world, what's happening. And so yeah, like that's just, it's a personal project I've been working on for many years. I finally the website's there, got it redesigned this summer. All the information is there and available, which is great. But yeah, other than that, like I think those are the only two things I would say of where else to find more information.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much. And thank you for listening to this episode of How It's Met. And thanks, Anish. Till next time.